There are 21 win conditions in Clash Royale, and while some of them take more skill than others, E-Golem, they all have so many common mistakes, tips, and tricks, as well as synergies that most players don't know about. So today I'm going to explain how to play every single win condition in Clash Royale. Starting off with the Goblin Barrel, which is one of the best win conditions in the game. This thing is really nice because it's really cheap and versatile, so it can fit in a ton of different decks, although it does specialize best in bait decks. And what you're trying to do there is get your opponent's Goblin Barrel counters out, or use cards that, when your opponent uses the barrel counter, get value since they just used their barrel counter. Log bait and Goblin Barrel in general is really good in the meta right now, being one of the top 3 most used win conditions at the end of last season. When you're playing the Goblin Barrel, what you want to try and do, if you can, is get something like a Knight or a Valkyrie or anything tanking for the Goblin Barrel. This is just the standard Goblin Barrel. Of course, you can also do this with the Evolved Barrel and get a double split lane push going, which is what makes the barrel really good. But the Goblin Barrel by itself is really easy to counter, so what the best bait players in the game do is make sure they always have something tanking for the barrel, and they always keep track of their opponent's barrel counters, and then counting their opponent's cycles to see where their barrel counters are at next, and therefore outplaying their opponent and using their other cards like Princess and Goblin Gang to their advantage when their opponent's log or arrows is out. Next up is the Elixir Golem. A lot of players actually use this deck wrong, which is really interesting. You typically don't want to start E-Golem in the back and then go Night Witch and then go, although that, could work against certain matchups, that's typically not what you want to do. You pair it with cards that are really broken on the counter push, such as Electro Dragon, Night Witch, Goblin Machine, I guess Rage and Goblin Curse too, although they're not really great on counter pushing. What you do is defend with one of those troops or both of those troops, and then create the really bad to deal with counter push by going E-Golem in front of it. And what you can also do is pair it with Skeleton King and go in the opposite lane. So let's say you go Goblin Machine Night Witch to counter a push, then you have a Goblin Machine Night Witch on one lane, you slap an E-Golem Skeleton King the other lane, because E-Golem only costs 3 elixir. It's really not hard to actually have enough elixir to build up a push with it. Then your opponent has to deal with 2 lanes, and this is typically safer, but if you know your opponent doesn't have a big spell, you can just stack it all in one lane. It's really simple to play. Just do that. Just counter push. Next up are the Royal Hogs. This is actually a really interesting card. The Royal Hogs typically good in cycle decks, like a lot of these win conditions are, because you want to get to as many of them as possible. If you can cycle really quickly, obviously things like the Royal Hogs are going to be really easy to counter maybe once or twice, but if you have a stupidly fast cycle or a champion in your deck, you're going to be able to cycle back to your Royal Hogs before your opponent can cycle back to their counter. So you're going to typically split lane push them a lot. You can split them so your opponent has to commit twice to them. Then you could pair things like a Firecracker with it, or things like an Earthquake, so you can get past buildings, because buildings are the worst things for Hoggy players to deal with. You can outcycle Valkyries and use Firecracker on them and stuff like that, but if you want to really break through with Hoggies, you're going to need to use the Earthquake in the majority of times. And a lot of players do make the mistake of just throwing Royal Hogs down, when in reality you should try and be saving them when your opponent is lower on elixir, or you see one of their hog counters go out. And a lot of players don't have to worry about having multiple fireball bait cards, although hogs work in recruits, because you don't need to fireball bait when you can just outcycle your opponent. And so you're going to be able to outcycle people really easily, and even if you can't, Earthquake typically breaks through, as well as the tough to break through defense of cycle decks. Next up is the Electro Giant. Electro Giant is what looks like a beatdown card that is just really not a beatdown card. While sometimes you can start it in the back depending on what your opponent's playing and what's in your hand, this is very similar to E-Golem in a way, where you want to use a deck that has a lot of counter pushable troops. You're going to see very common similarities between E-Giant decks and Graveyard decks, because there's going to be a lot of Tornado, Baby Dragon, Splash. Tornado is a must pair with the Electro Giant. Don't try and use it without it, as well as Lightning. You're going to see a lot of people use that combination, and you want to try and counter push with your Electro Giant. Don't try and start up a push in the back, although this can work to try and maybe cycle 2 Electro Giants. Don't try and do this every time. Let's say you just go E-Giant in the back. okay, and then your opponent pressures you, you have to play Baby Dragon Knight in the other lane. Now you have a naked E-Giant going on the other lane that can be countered by a Tombstone, and you don't have enough elixir to lightning because you spent all your elixir on defense. So what you could do is not go E-Giant in the back and instead use it as a counter push so that you can make sure that after defending you have the ability to put your E-Giant down and then use the NATO or lightning to finish the opponents off. Also, your E-Giant decks typically have very good defense, so you don't need to prioritize getting the E-Giant to the tower because it can be very hard sometimes. Prioritize the defense in Electro Giant decks. Lava Hound is up next, and Lava Hound, while unlike its beatdown counterparts because it doesn't really do a lot by itself, kind of just sits there and burps at the tower, it is very dangerous because it can protect air units, and typically a lot of players don't have multiple air units in their deck. You'll average maybe 2 to 3, like one being a building and 2 being, you know, air cards like Firecracker and Spear Goblins, or, you know, there's like 552,000 different air combinations. Typically going to want to start up a lava push when you know your opponent can't pressure you well, or you're up elixir, or you have your spell, and you have your spells in cycle. Actually, you want to be going lava when you know you can afford to back it up, because like the E-Giant in a lot of ways, if you go Lava Hound, your opponent pressures you the opposite lane and you respond, now you can't go with an air troop and a spell with your Lava Hound, which means you're not going to be able to have near effectiveness. This is why you see a lot of lava players tower trade, because they need to spend the elixir on offense or else they're not going to be able to break through. So make sure you're going lava at the right time and you track your opponent's air cards and don't use your spells when you don't use your spells unless you're going in. You always want to go lava at the right time when your opponents don't have the right plays to counter push you, and at the same time, knowing when to give up on a lava push is really good as well, because if you overextend, your opponents will punish you also. Expo is up next, and Expo is a really fun deck to play because you can absolutely steamroll and outplay your opponents, putting them on a t-shirt. It's really fun. What you typically do with Expo is cycle to your Evo Archers as soon as you can. Evo Tesla helps as well, and you'll mainly see one Expo deck being used, which is 3.0. There are other decks. I've never seen somebody put an Expo in a homemade deck, actually, so I'm going to assume everybody who wants to play Expo is going to use Icebo, shout out to Hunter, 3.0, or shout out to SK, I guess, or they're going to use Pumpo. I have nobody to shout out for Pumpo. But you're going to see Expo players mainly stick to the same strategy of cycling to their Evo Archers and using the surprise factor of the Evo Archers to break through a lot of the time. You're going to not just throw Expos at the bridge. You want to time your Expos very well and play very effective defense for the majority of the game. Just play the defense, try and save your Tesla and your Evo Archers if possible, and wait for your opponent to make a misplay or force them into a misplay. Just watching what they have for ground countering on your Expo. If they have a bowler, don't go Expo while you know they have bowler in hand. Try and force it out. But if push comes to shove, fireball cycling also works. And you can also just spell, I mean, aside from spell damaging, you can also outcycle your opponents really well. So you're going to see Expo players that are good, constantly switching lanes to keep applying pressure for their opponent. Being unpredictable is one of the best things you can do with 3.0 and just Expo in general. So when you're playing Expo, don't be predictable and make sure you're always keeping an eye on what your opponent has to counter your Expos, because it can be really easy once you track that to predict your opponents and get cool TikTok clips. The Royal Giant is really good as well. I haven't really covered evolutions in this video too much, but I'll talk about both the base and the evolution version. Royal Giant is really effective because he's going to be able to rely on cards like the Monk, the Fisherman, the Evo Hunter to allow him to just get 1 or 2 hits. That's all you need against effectively good players and really hard defense. And you can do this by sometimes going Royal Giant to back. Sometimes you don't need to go Royal Giant to back. You can also use the counter pushing strategy that has worked with E-Golem and E-Giant. I kind of explained that already. But what you can do with Royal Giant is pair it with these cards. You typically want to use it in a fast cycle deck so you can try and get to as many Royal Giants as possible, because if your opponent has counters to the Royal Giant, the odds are they're not going to be able to use the same counter every time if you're playing a fast cycle deck. If you're playing a really slow deck with Royal Giant, you're not going to be able to cycle nearly as many Royal Giants. So Royal Giant is a really good card to pick up in the meta. It's really strong, and although you'll see Royal Giant players run into struggles on top 100 ladder, it's not really an issue for mid ladder, and you're typically going to dominate with the effective defense and just counter pushing, because sometimes if you play the game right and you just focus focus on your defense and getting positive elixir trades, as well as even a minimal amount of elixir tracking and tracking cycle, you're going to be able to just win off of one Royal Giant push. And you know, if you really don't want to play the Royal Giant Ghost version, which is kind of the harder version to play, slap a monk in your deck and you're going to see your Royal Giant stock skyrocket. Next up is the Hog Rider. Now the Hog Rider is really good and probably one of my go-to like decks to give a new player, or win conditions, I guess, since we're not talking about specific decks, but it's best in Hog Earthquake right now. That's going to be the absolute best deck for it, and Hog Earthquake extremely effective, and you can unlock it as early as like one of the earliest arenas in the game, I'm pretty sure. Hog Rider is going to be really effective in another fast cycle deck. You typically see him paired with champions so that your opponents can't really deal with multiple Hog Riders, because although Hog Rider is typically pretty easy to counter with maybe a NATO or a building, if you have the 3-card cycle with a champion, dude, you're not going to be able to NATO and building every single one of these. If you're playing the right Hog Rider decks and you're just playing solid defense, again, you can use a similar strategy as most of the cycle decks on this list, or cycle win conditions, and just out-chip your opponent and just play good defense. Focus on the defense, look at what your opponents are playing, and when you catch them low in elixir, or if you like perchance know that they have a cannon and the only thing they can play is a cannon, pre-earthquake it, get your hog in the tower. Or even 3 swings from the hog can just win you the game. So Hog Rider, very, I don't want to say easy to play, it's easy to start playing, it's good to master, easy to max. At least there's non-champion versions out there. Don't play naked hogs, try to avoid that if you can, and watch my Hog Rider coaching video with Ian I just posted. Mortar is a win condition that is just extremely weak without its evolution. Although, you know, you can spend 24 elixir in 4.5 minutes to try and get 1 mortar hit, typically try and use the evolution. It might, honestly, it might not even be worth it to use Mortar if you don't have its evolution, which is kind of displayed by the fact that there's not a single Mortar player that doesn't use the evolution in the top 200 or the top 1000 ladder that's tracked. So typically with the Mortar, you want to pair it with cards like the Miner and the Cannon Cart. That way the Cannon Cart can, even after the nerf, it's I don't want to say it's a good card, it's a decent card. It's going to be able to provide that range damage to kill the things that your opponents might play on the Mortar, and with the evolved Mortar, the Miner is going to be able to tank for the goblins, which is actually a really effective strategy that's really hard to stop in the right circumstances. Maybe pair it with bats, goblin gangs, spear goblins, so if your opponents have counters to 1 or 2 of them, you still have the other one that can't be countered. And since the Mortar isn't the most reliable form of damage, since it's pretty easy to counter, you typically want to pair it with another win condition. The Mortar is, however, still good with the Miner and the Cannon Cart. It's good with bait decks. It's good in fast cycle if you can't use a bait deck. It's also typically, if you're going to use a bait deck, you don't need a big spell, but I would put a big spell in your Mortar deck if you don't have like another way to get damage, because it's going to be very frustrating to get damage with Mortar. It's significantly more difficult than Expo, and you know, Mortar is, while the Evo Mortar is very strong, it's not that easy to get connections with. There's a lot of outplay potential though, so if you're interested in Mortar, it's a great deck to try and learn. There's tons of outplays you can do. Graveyard is a very strong win condition, especially after the release of the Evo Witch, because those two collaborate hand in hand. Graveyard is a card that is usually, there were times when it was Splash Yard, it was the main graveyard deck. You'd pair it with Baby Drag Ice with NATO. Typically you won't see as much NATO after the NATO nerf anymore. You'll see Poison, Goblin Hut, Witch, Ice Wizard. You're going to see a very slow type of deck with Graveyard. With Graveyard, you want to play very slow, very defensively, and very similar to Electro Giant, as we mentioned at the beginning, where you want to try and counter push with your defense. You always want to try and tank for your Graveyard with a Knight or something. Knight's just the most popular option. I guess Valkyrie works as well, and against Cannoneer, I guess you don't need to do this, but Graveyard is really effective when you're counter pushing, because you can apply constant pressure on your opponent, and because they know you have a Graveyard usually, so you're going to be able to constantly get good defense, try and turn your defense into counter pushes, force out your opponent's Graveyard cards, and always pair Graveyard with Poison so that you can kill things like Goblin Gangs, guards, make your Graveyard way harder to stop. A lot of Graveyard games go to overtime because you have very effective defense. The basic strategy: stall out your opponents, try and get counter pushes, and win off of poison chip damage as well as a few graveyard hits if that doesn't work. What always goes well is to pair your graveyard with very strong defensive cards, because graveyard isn't extremely reliable. You'll see giant graveyard decks out there, but typically the best graveyard decks have really effective defense, and you want to force your opponents to have to deal with your counter pushes and see their mistakes, capitalize on it, go in with the graveyards, and win. Goblin Giant is really strong, especially its Evo. You're going to see most people use the Evo. If you're using Goblin Giant, try and use the Evolution. It's very good in Goblin Giant P.E.K.K.A. There's some E-Barb Sparky decks out there that work too, but they're not great. Goblin Giant is one of the best ground tanks in the game, because it's going to be able to, if you don't have anything tanking for the Spear Goblins, get a ton of damage on the tower. And if you do have something tanking for the Spear Goblins, it's going to help be a Dollar Tree version of the E-Giant, where it's going to kill support troops or at least damage them. So typically pairing this with cards like the Rage help, because they speed up the Spear Goblins on the back as well as the spawn rate of the Evo Goblin Giant. And you're always going to want to use support troops that are dangerous and, you know, can apply a lot of pressure as well. This is why you're going to see Goblin Giant typically used with a lot of really hefty win condition or support troops like Prince, E-Barb, Sparky, because Goblin Giant is on the lower end of the health tier. So sometimes you'll see Royal Chef used with them to buff up his health a little bit, but Goblin Giant is usually not the main threat. It's the support troops. So pair it with really like what am I even talking? Pair it with good damaging support troops like the Prince, like the E-Barbs. You'll see Goblin Giant P.E.K.K.A. be very strong right now, like the Goblin Machine. Goblin Giant by itself is pretty effective, especially if you're using other threats in your deck, so that your opponents have to not just respond to the Goblin Giant. Because like a lot of bait decks, if you have Goblin Giant and E-Barbs and Sparky and P.E.K.K.A. and Goblin Machine, you're going to force your opponents to have to worry about multiple things. And if they defend one thing properly, maybe they don't have something else for your Goblin Giant. Play it opposite lane, take the whole tower. Goblin Drill is probably the only win condition on this list that's best not used with its evolution. Goblin Drill's not good. It's not good as an evolution at all, but the normal card is pretty good, and you're going to pair it with cards like the Evo Snowball, like the Poison, like maybe the Fireball in obscure circumstances, and especially Goblin Demolisher. He's actually really good with it. You're going to want your drill decks to be extremely fast, and you're going to look out for what your opponents have to counter your drills. This is really easy to do, because typically you can play your drill in the first 20 seconds of the game, find out what your opponent's got, and then maybe play another one, find out if your opponent has a different counter, and now you can start to plan and plot. What do we have a snowball for things? How do we use our other troops to maybe outcycle the opponent, or maybe we can use it to force out one of the cards? But Goblin Drill is another one of those cycle decks that it's a win condition. It isn't extremely reliable. It's not going to like one lock win you the game, so your defense is going to need to be really good, which is why it's in a cycle deck usually. Goblin Drill is not going to be really good if it's not in a cycle deck, because you want to get as many drills as possible, and you want to have fast and effective and cheap defense so that you can try and apply pressure on your opponents and not have to really worry too much about the defensive end of things. Keep an eye on your opponent's counters and use the snowball to either knock these counters off. Always switch up your drill placements, and don't be afraid to go in the opposite lane with your Goblin Demolishers, with your Knights. Don't be afraid to counter push, and you don't always have to go drill in the same lane as your counter push. You could also go opposite lane as well. Next up is the Giant, which is a cheap win condition that honestly is usually used as a meat shield. Don't get me wrong, the Giant is like formidable and he's hard to deal with sometimes, but you're going to use him mainly to soak up damage for your main win condition, which can be support troops like Prince and Dark Prince, and maybe Eva Lumberjack, or Graveyard, as we kind of mentioned Giant Graveyard earlier. You're going to see Giant used as a really good effective meat shield. He's cheap, so you don't really have to worry that much. Like with Lava Hound, you really have to worry about when you go in with Giant. You don't have to worry that hard about going in with Giant, but it's still going to be really effective to try and counter push with your Giant if at all possible. possible. However, there's nothing wrong with starting up a giant in the back, because at only 5 elixir, you're not going to be able to get easily pressured in the opposite lane, and since you don't necessarily need to back up your giant, it's perfectly fine to just go giant in the back, prince the other lane, and now your opponent has 2 things to worry about. Typically, you're going to see the giant paired with big spells so that you can break through buildings, not the earthquake. There's just no synergy there. You want to be able to kill support troops as well, so lightning, usually the go-to, and you want to pair it with things like prince and just any support troop really you could put behind your giant. It doesn't matter. He's going to be very effective at tanking for a relatively cheap cost, and you got to watch out for him on the tower as well. Golem is a little bit similar to Lava Hound in a sense that it's going to be hard to go Golem and then just, you know, you play defense in the lane, which is why you're going to see Golem paired with things like the Bomber usually, and you usually want to pair Golem with Night Witch. It's a really successful combo, but a lot of successful Golem decks right now are control decks, so you're going to wait and just very similar to E-Giant, like in Royal Giant, I guess, in Graveyard, as we kind of talked about. You're going to play defense, you're going to play good defense, you're going to use the defense counter pushes to then go Golem, but typically Golem's not really easy to play in front of your pushes. You're just going to be really patient with your Golems. Going Golem early in the game, if your opponent has the right setup, can just lose you the game instantly, so you want to be very patient, focus on defense for the majority of the game, and when you have the right time to go Golem, start up a big Golem push, pair it with things like the NATO, the Evo E-Drag, in certain circumstances, I guess the Lightning, although that is really expensive. Balloon is also interesting because Balloon, it's mainly used in La Balloon, but there's also Balloon decks by themselves where you're typically going to want to use Evo Musketeer or Miner, or I guess, let me start with Ice Golem or Miner to tank for your Balloon, so you can get many balloons. You want a fast cycle as well. Balloon's not a card that you want to have a slow cycle in unless you're playing Lava Balloon, because Lava Balloon is just a totally different type of deck. When I use Balloon as a win condition, I mainly mean as your main win condition. You're going to want a fast cycle, pair it with maybe the Evo Musketeer to snipe buildings and air troops. You can also out-cycle your opponents really easily. Keep an eye on their air cards and use things like the Snowball to knock things off your balloons so you can get guaranteed death bomb, or in the best circumstance, actually get a balloon hit. Miner is not really good as a main win condition. It's really outdated. People don't really use Miner as a main win condition anymore. He's a good secondary win condition. You're going to see that in a lot of decks, but I wouldn't build your deck around just the Miner. I would pair it with any other, like you could pair the Miner with literally any deck in the game and have some success with it. But as a win condition, the Miner is almost not even worth talking about because it's not really consistently going to be your main win condition. The Miner is really effective to snipe maybe your opponent's troops as counters, or maybe use the tower chip damage, but typically you're going to see the Miner just used to tank for things as majority of the time. Wall breakers are a secondary win condition as well. You're going to see them paired with the Miner oftentimes, and they're going to be especially good as an evolution. Miner wall breakers evolution is so good. It is going to destroy things on defense as well. It's going to apply insane pressure. Wall breakers are a really good secondary win condition to throw in your deck if you do need another win condition, and wall breakers are going to consistently apply pressure, force out spells. You want to pair it with cheap decks, but you don't need to, honestly. You just want to apply a lot of pressure with your wall breakers decks. You don't want wall breakers to be the only thing your opponent has to worry about. Pair it with other cards that your opponents have to worry about, and then you're going to be all good. Battle Ram is really interesting because I wouldn't say it's a main win condition. The Evo is pretty strong. Battle Ram typically used in bridge spam decks as another form of pressure, just like the heavier version of the wall breakers in a way. You're not going to really rely on the Battle Ram to get you damage, but since it targets the tower, it is the win condition. It's close enough. It can connect, especially if you track your opponent's cycle right, play the right pressure cards, and always try and pair your Battle Ram with every single card that's like good on pressuring. You're going to see bridge spam cards, Royal Ghost, Bandit, Boss Bandit, stuff like that being used with the Battle Ram to apply pressure, so your Battle Ram isn't the only thing your opponent has to worry about, and so it's going to be harder for them to deal with. And always keep an eye on what your opponents have for the Battle Ram counters, so you don't play your Battle Ram directly into a counter. Skeleton Barrel is also interesting as a secondary win condition. It's not really a reliable source of damage, but just like the wall breakers and the Battle Ram, it's going to apply significant pressure on your opponents, always forcing out a spell or a swarm unit. And even if the skeletons don't get damage, it typically gets good impact damage as well. So always try and tank for your skeleton barrels sometimes if you can, but don't be afraid to just chuck them at the tower. If your opponents have a building in your deck, probably wait to play your skeleton barrel until the building is off the board, or use something else to force out that building and then go skeleton barrel. And always use a skeleton barrel with other bait cards that will capitalize on your opponent having to waste something on the skelly barrel, or vice versa. Ram Rider is also really it's really similar to Battle Ram and Hog Rider, but it's a bit harder to get to the tower given that it's easy to just stun and sometimes stop with the building. You're going to see it played in bridge spam cards or bridge spam decks as well in its most effective state, although it's fell off a little bit and it's not as good as the Battle Ram. Ram Rider is going to be a good option in Mega Knight decks and bridge spam decks as a replacement for the Battle Ram, and it's going to have a nice snare, which is sometimes good on defense against things like the balloon. But typically you want to pair the Ram Rider just like the Battle Ram with Ram Rider tips. Don't play it directly into buildings. Use it to force out counters for your other cards, or vice versa, so that you can get your battle or your Ram Rider to the tower and you don't give your opponents free counters. Finally, we have Three Musketeers. Three Musketeers are really bad, but they're good as a surprise troop sometimes. So if you can use the Three Musketeers to surprise your opponents, you can win pretty easily. And typically you want to use your Three Musketeers when your opponents can't just spell it instantly, because that's the biggest weakness of the card. If you have Three Musketeers, you need to try and pair your deck with cards that can also spell bait. So maybe things like Minion Hordes, so your opponents can't just spell your Three Musketeers instantly. But if you can surprise your opponent, I guess Three Musketeers are not the worst thing in the world. But you usually want to pair them with Fireball bait, and I wouldn't recommend playing them at all. Just don't.